by the farmer.
Who is he?
No, well, who or where is he?
This particular photo is from Honduras,
Mhm.
where I worked for about 19 years. Before that, I worked in Guatemala for 12 years, and the last 10 years I've been working in Africa, in a number of different countries. But anyway, so the next thing you can see in the photo is that there's some grass behind him, and all that his son is also sitting on. That's a Napier grass barrier that keeps the water washing away with his soil. It's on a contour, and there is a hill behind him, although you can't see it because of all the organic matter growing there, frankly. And the amount of soil that is trapped, that started to erode down the hillside and was stopped by the grass, is very easy to see because his son is sitting on that pile of ground. In other words, gradually that row of grass, which was very easy to plant, took a couple of days to protect a whole hectare of land, which is about 2.5 acres. Now, after about 6 years, he's got almost a meter of soil that would have flown down the hillside if it hadn't been trapped by that grass, which he's sitting on. And the last thing I love about this photo is that Laureano's son is still living in the village. In most of Honduras and huge areas of Africa, you never meet a young fella his age in the villages because they've all gone to the cities, because they know that their farms, their parents' farms, are not going to be producing anything within 10 or 20 years. I mean, they're just going to no longer be producing. And so,
Roland, pardon me. This is Charlie Shore.
I have a statistic for Latin America, but in Africa right now, the average age of a smallholder farmer out in the villages is 54. All the youth have gone to the slums because they just don't see any.
Roland, pardon me. This is Charlie Shore. The traditional recommendation is to add a certain amount of brown biomaterial to your compost pile. Do you know specifically why the green? Is the green manure better than a mixed manure? Or do we have any data on that?
Well, better in what way? Frankly, forests don't do that sort of thing. Forests just drop leaves on the ground, and they rot, and worms and so forth take them down into the soil and so forth. I mean, if we're going to follow the traditional systems, now the one thing we haven't done yet that we feel we should do in order to imitate a forest is to have animals incorporated in this. Now, we certainly have a lot more earthworms than this kind of soil used to have, but we'd like to see how we can incorporate some other animals that aren't going to eat the maize. So we're working on that. But the problem is comparing compost with this is not very productive, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Okay, we'll move to the next photo. Okay, when in world history were green manures first used? Now, I was going to ask everybody, but since this is a virtual conference, that's not so easy. But I'm sure the answer will surprise you. There are in existence today articles advising farmers on how to use green manure crops from both Europe and China that were written before the Christian era. So these things have been around a long time. Now, a lot of scientific articles during the last, well, especially in the 1990s and the early 2000s, had tried some green manures in ways you should never use them, and then concluded that because they hadn't worked, that green manures don't work in general. But if somebody tells you that green manures don't work, how can they explain that for 500 years in Europe and over 200 years in the United States, in other words, the entire history of our both areas before World War II, virtually every commercial farmer used green manures? I mean, were farmers incompetent in those days? I don't believe that. I believe that, in fact, green manures do work, and I know they work because we use them now, and farmers adopt them at a very fast clip. But you'll still read literature that says green manures don't work. Or, for instance, there was an article just written about 3 years ago by eCraft in in Nairobi, saying that, well, only trees really work as green manures, other plants don't. Well, you know, this is just patently false. It's just wrong. Okay, now, because almost all our textbooks on soils are written, have at least one author who is from a fertilizer company, and I checked that out one day in the Mann Library at Cornell, which is one of the best agricultural libraries in the entire United States. I found 15 different textbooks that were first-year textbooks for college students that were studying soils. 15 of them. Every single one of them had at least a co-author who was an active employee of a fertilizer company. So they don't say too much very positive about green manure cover crops. But this photo is very interesting. This is the experience that made us start working with green manure cover crops back in 1983. It was a farmer who didn't believe what we were saying about organic matter and its importance in the soil, even though we didn't know the half of it back then, or the 10th of it. And so he was going to try it out and see if what we were saying was true. So he made 16 compost heaps and poured it into the soil in the left-hand part of this photo. And then he left 2 rows of maize. We had taught people to experiment because we believe farmer experimentation has to be part of any extension process. So he left 2 rows without any compost. One, you can see where the arrows are, and the other one is about half as tall as the others and a little bit yellower right in the dead center, in the center of the photo. Okay, now that maize there obviously sent some roots over and stole some of the compost from its neighbors. But the row that had, you know, absolutely has no compost is the one where the arrows are. That row of maize and the maize on the left-hand side of the photo are all the same seed planted on the same day. Okay, now I didn't even believe it myself. The farmer didn't show us this field until this day that I took this photo, because he was so embarrassed that he'd been so wrong. And we had no idea that you know, a lot of compost could make that much difference. We had no idea. But you can see it there. In fact, the day after I took this photo, I went around to all this fellow's neighbors and asked them what they knew about these plots and whether the maize was all planted at the same time and whether he'd snuck a little bit of chemical fertilizer in there and all this sort of thing. And they said, no, that's all because of compost.
Okay,
So
Roland,
we
I have
decided
a
we had to do
question.
something to try and increase the amount of organic matter in people's soils. And because the problem all over the world is that the maize looks like the maize in the center there, and sometimes even the maize on the right instead of the maize on the left. Yeah, did somebody want to say something?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
I want to know, why do you use the term green manure rather than gilded growing? Is that for funding reasons or ecological reasons?
Green manure rather than?
Using the term growing in guilds. You're growing in guilds. You're growing towards a 7-layer forest system.
Yeah.
And
I
so why
only
are
use
you
that
using
term
the
because
word?
that's the traditional agricultural term. And then in Latin America, people have adopted green manure cover crops as a way of saying that we do both. We improve the soil and we control weeds. But it's just,
So it's a transitional
nothing
term?
else. I mean, I like your other terms better, but you know, I have
People are
to go
not
with,
ready for them. Okay.
yeah. I mean, see, I usually show this to agricultural people, and green manures and green manure cover crops are the terms they know. Yeah.
I got you.
So this is what people can do now. There's another thing they can do, which is even more surprising. I didn't even, you know, I'd worked for 20 years with green manure cover crops before I discovered this, because I'd been working more in areas where there was a fair amount of rain. This is in drought-prone Africa on the island of Madagascar. And this woman, as you can see, her maize field is not doing real well there. She's got maize and then little clumps of what we call cowpeas, which is well, the black-eyed pea in the United States is a cowpea, type of cowpea. You can see the leaves are all curled up very tightly on this maize. That's a sign of drought. Okay, I mean the maize will turn yellow and so forth if it doesn't have nutrients, but if it doesn't have water, the leaves will curl up. They look like somebody's rolled a cigarette or something. And but she also has a field right next to this, and you can see some of the field over on the right extreme of the photo in the background, where you see a massive, really dark green color. Well, here's that field. Now, these photos were taken about 10 minutes apart from each other. They're both in the same field. And I can prove that in one very simple way that was just totally a fluke. If you look up at the top right extreme of this photo, you'll see three clouds. One is pointed on the right, then there's a real small one, and then there's a sort of a roundish one on the left, okay? An ovaloid cloud. Those three clouds are just left of center in this photo. You can see they're exactly the same clouds. These photos were taken a few minutes away from each other and a few meters or yards away from each other, okay? In other words, this maize went through the same drought that the other maize did, unless you believe that, you know, rainfall sort of stops right at a fence line. And you know, this had just as much drought as the other one did, but this one, in fact, is going to produce quite well. Now, you can see it went through a drought because near the vetiver grass on the right, you can see some of the leaves there are slightly curled. But if you look at the center and the center left of the photo, you're going to see the vast majority of the leaves are flat as a pancake, okay? And that's in spite of the fact that this maize is growing better, and each plant has gotten more moisture, in spite of the fact that the density of plants here is much, much greater. If you look here, you'll see the plants were planted quite a ways away because she knew that the plants were not going to grow very well, and they needed all the water and all the nutrients they could get. So she planted them really far apart just to be able to get some kind of a harvest, which she probably won't because of the drought. But in this case, they're planted much closer together because she knows this land is fertile, and it's going to hold plenty of water. The reason for the difference is that cowpea down there, which is also in this photo, the same plant, has been growing for 6 years on this field. And this is the first year it was grown on this field. That's the only difference between the two fields. Okay? That's the impact that green manure cover crops can have on rainfall. I've now seen similar experiences in 5 different countries in Africa, all the way from Mali in West Africa to Kenya in East Africa, and Madagascar and Mozambique and Malawi in Southern Africa. So this is something that will happen virtually everywhere. And this is very good news because Africa right now is suffering from severe droughts, and they're going to get worse and worse. Okay, so what are green manure cover crops? Green manure cover crops are defined as any plants with trees, bushes, climbers, crawlers, creepers, or even water-borne plants that farmers can use, among many other things, to fertilize the soil, control weeds, or end the droughts, okay? Now, what are the other advantages? Well, what are all the advantages of green manure cover crops? It's really amazing what they can do. First of all, we get a lot more soil organic matter and increased soil nitrogen because most of them, the vast majority of them, are legumes. And that means that they are fixing nitrogen. In fact, they fix tremendous amounts of nitrogen, as I'll show you in a minute. Most farmers in Africa with these green manure cover crops can go from about 1 ton, which is the average in Africa right now, of maize per hectare per year, up to 3 and sometimes 4 tons. 4 tons those are good results, but we're getting that more and more and more. So they're able to
Howard, I have a question.
quadruple the yields they used to get just 6 or 8 years previously.
Howard? Roland?
Yeah.
Is it important for the growing seasons of the different crops to kind of overlap so that you don't have like bare ground in winter and so forth? I realize a lot of these, you're talking about tropical countries, but do you want to have one plant growing while the other is declining?
Absolutely. We want to try and keep live roots in the ground all the time. And this is important, not just because farmers have noticed it and seen it, It's also important because we're finding out now from research on microbiology that the existence of live roots help maintain all sorts of population of really, really positive, beneficial microorganisms in the soil, especially fungi. This is very, very important if you really want to get high yields. So yes, we want to keep roots in the soil all the time. That's one of the reasons we use trees so often, because obviously trees have their roots in the soil for 50 solid years, 100 solid years, depending on the species. And all the green manures we use in the droughty areas of Africa are legumes, which are capable of growing through the dry season. Okay. And then, of course, we have to have fences, and we've just found a really wonderful live fence just 2 years ago that is working tremendously well to keep the cattle out, the free roaming cattle during the dry season. So yes, the answer is yes with an exclamation point to your question. Okay.
So what is the live fence?
A live fence is usually a tree that will grow. Usually it has some small thorns on it to keep the animals from leaning against it in order to get in. And that will grow, but that can be pruned so that it's not too tall and it doesn't take up too much space for where farmers want to plant their crops.
Which species are you using?
Well, the one we're using right now has a kind of a funny name. It's called the monkey thorn tree. It's an acacia, an acacia that's native to Southern Africa. And it's so popular that we're selling the seed. We aren't giving it away. We're selling it at about $3 a kilo. And farmers are thrilled. They're this last year in one little program that we only spent $4,000 on, farmers planted over 30 miles, 50 kilometers of fencing in 1 year, and they were buying all the seed. I mean, I have rarely seen farmers so thrilled with anything I've worked with. Okay, so this can be accomplished by smallholder farmers at virtually no cost and with no fertilizer. In fact, if the green manures are plants like the Lablab plant that I'll show you in a minute, they also produce food, in fact, high protein food. And that means that usually they are making money. The food will more than this food, if they sell it in the market, will more than cover the costs, the few costs they had in planting the green manure. So you're getting fertility, you're getting drought resistance, you're getting weed control at a negative cost in many cases. Okay, now not always. Sometimes there is a little bit of cost in labor. There's no cost okay, they have to buy a handful of seed to get started. From then on, they produce their own seed, and so there's after the first year, there's no cost whatsoever, and the handful of seed will cost a few pennies. So it's an extremely low cost technology that has tremendous impact on farmers' well-being. 3, high proteins for food. Legumes, of course, have more proteins than most of the grains people are eating now. 4th, dry season fodder for animals. We'll see a case of that a little later. 5, help in controlling weeds. And this is very important, especially for women, because, for instance, maize has to be weeded twice. And women do all the weeding of food crops. So that's the worst. It's the worst labor women have to do during the year in terms of physical strength and just being out in the sun and the whole business. Furthermore, the second weeding happens right at the height of the hunger season, which comes before you get your next crops. So the second weeding, they're not only doing the months of work swinging a hoe out in the fields, they're doing it without having had a decent breakfast or lunch or dinner. So eliminating that second weeding is tremendously important for the women, believe me. Okay, prohibition of droughts. There was a farmer in Zambia that we were visiting that was using green manure cover crops because of a non-governmental organization working there. Prior to my arrival, I mean, I had nothing to do with it. And this farmer we were visiting had wonderful maize, looking like the maize on the left of that first photo I showed you, or the second photo. And all around him, the maize was less than waist high and in severe, suffering severely from droughts. One of the visitors with me asked him, well, what's going on here? How come your field is so much better than all the rest? And the farmer said, well, those of us that planted Gliricidia trees 6 years ago have prohibited the droughts. That was the way he said it. And I like that saying, so I use it. But anyway, we can prohibit the droughts. 7, sequestration of tremendous amounts of atmospheric carbon, reducing climate change. Okay, this is something we didn't cotton to until about 4 or 5 years ago also. But we are putting 40 to 50 tons per hectare. Now this is green weight, not dry weight. 40 to 50 tons per hectare per year of organic matter in the soil. Very close to 50% of all that organic matter is carbon. Okay, so that means 25 tons we're putting in the soil each year. Now, of that, a lot of it will escape and be, you know, it becomes part of microorganisms that breathe, and so they exhale some of it in the form of carbon dioxide, just like humans do, et cetera, et cetera. So of the long-term carbon, which is the important part, once the soils are fairly good, which, like I say, takes 4 or 5 years, but once they've gotten their organic matter content of the soil up to a decent level, the soil will sequester using even the sort of just medium quality green manure cover crop systems that we use, will sequester somewhere around 6 tons per hectare of maize long term. Now that means, well, I'll talk about, well, actually, let me go ahead and say it now. That means that at that rate, and you can do the arithmetic if you want, if all the farmers in the world, both large and small scale, were to use green manure cover crops and get the same levels of productivity. Now, farmers in the United States are going to have a rough time doing that because of the ecological conditions, but the ranchers should be able to exceed it quite significantly. So they should be able to average the same as what we're getting in Africa between the farmers and the ranchers. If all the farmers and the ranchers of the world were to sequester this much carbon in the soil long term, they alone would meet over 75% of all the carbon sequestration we need to do by the year 2100 in order to meet the Paris Accord goals. 70%. That's a total game changer. I mean, even you know, I read recent magazines by Time and by The Economist, where they had the whole magazine dedicated to climate change. They never mentioned this fact once. They never mentioned anything about cover crops. They don't even know that this is happening. But smallholder farmers in Africa, just the smallholder farmers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America could sequester over 5% of all the carbon that we need to meet the Paris Accord goals. And if all the farmers in the world, including the wealthy farmers, did the same thing, like I say, we'd meet over 75% of the goals for sequestering carbon that were stated by the Paris Accords. A lot of this pessimism that both those magazines, for instance, had about reaching the goals is totally because of ignorance. You know, it's poorly informed judgments. Okay, now I'm sure you've never seen a photo like this, at least not in any textbooks in the United States. These are the nodules from one single green manure cover crop plant from the genus Mucuna. Okay, Mucuna puriens. Okay, those are whole golf balls of nodules. Now, if you remember your college textbooks, they would have one little nodule, maybe 2 millimeters in diameter, every inch or 2 inches along a root. Well, that's fertilizer company propaganda. That's nonsense. I mean, you know, we wouldn't work with these things if that's all they could fix. These things are fixing tremendous amounts of nitrogen in the soil. In fact, this particular plant is not the best we have. And interestingly enough, the best plant we have for fixing nitrogen out of the more than 100 species of plants we use in different parts of the world. The one that fixes the most nitrogen is one that grows up in high altitudes in the Andes, which means it would grow very well in the northern United States. But I don't know of anybody that has any. It's called Tardui. And it's a member of the lupin family. It also has a edible seed to it, but it fixes the equivalent of in a hectare of about 16 sacks of urea would provide you, which
Can
is
you
more than
spell
any
that
farmer in the
for
United
us?
States would ever put on his crops. Okay, it fixes 480 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Okay, so you know we're talking about a totally new ball game in terms of how much nitrogen and how much organic matter we can get in the soil.
Roland, could you
Now,
spell
I wouldn't have
Spell
believed
it.
Can you
Please spell
Pardon?
it.
spell that word, please?
The name of the plant?
Yes.
Okay, I think in English it's spelled Tarwi. It's Lupinus. Ooh, I can't remember, but anyway, it should be on you know, if you Google that, you should get it. In Spanish, it's spelled Tarhui, but it's a like I say, it's a lupin, and it's grown all over the Andes. Actually, it has different names in Spanish, about a different name in each country. Okay. Now
Roland?
this is Mucuna puriens, and it'll be all over the literature.
Is there any comparable one for North America that's a native that we could use without spoiling the native lupins or something?
Well, this isn't going to spoil any of your native lupins. I mean, they have it all over the Andes, and there's all sorts of other lupin plants there too. So, I mean, you know, it's not, we don't, if a plant is going to become invasive, we don't use it. In other words, those 100 species I talk about, actually it's somewhat over 100. And that doesn't even include the trees. But of those, what was I going to say? Well,
I'm just looking for a
those,
Native American.
those, I'm counting only those that we've eliminated, those that we haven't eliminated, because they can be become a
Invasive.
problem. You know, they can
Right.
become
I was just wondering if you had North America ones that were native to North America.
That we
Well,
can use.
The one I think I'm not sure if it's native, but it's been in, well, yes, it is, because it was here before the white people came. So yes, the one that would be the best is one you probably have eaten. It's called fava beans.
Uh-huh.
Now it'll fix about a quarter of what that plant I was talking about does, but that's more than enough for your crops to do very, very well. Yeah, just grow fava beans, you know, rotate fava beans with whatever else you're growing in your garden, and you'll see a big difference in your garden.
Roland, do you use on these fields that you're working with in Africa and elsewhere, do you also use no-till farming?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. In fact, we use conservation agriculture, which has 3 rules, one of which is no-till or minimum till at least. And frankly, what happens almost always with these green manures is after about 2 or 3 years, the farmers start saying, my gosh, my soil is really soft now. And it's dark and everything. You know, I'm going to try not plowing, because, I mean, what's the point of plowing? It's like plowing the ocean. And which is a Bolivarian, Simon Bolivar said that. I wasn't the first one to invent that phrase. But anyway, yeah, usually farmers themselves, after about 3 or 4 years, will realize there's no point in plowing anymore, and they'll quit.
Is that because the soil is simply soft enough to shove the seeds in without preparing a row?
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. And the weeds are able to go way down into the soil without any effort, and so forth and so on. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, which is another reason why I say that these things often are have a negative cost because, you know, if you eliminate weeding and you eliminate plowing, you're saving a lot of labor and a lot of cost. So, you know, for smallholder farmers. So, you know, if you get something that can do both of those, then you're going to save yourself a lot of money in addition to all the benefits that these things provide. Okay, talking about high protein foods. I was on the island of Sumatra once. Well, I've been there several times, but the agronomists were telling me in southern Sumatra that, well, you know, in Indonesia we don't have green manures because we don't eat beans, we don't eat peas. You know, they cause flatulence, and we don't like that, so we just don't eat them. So anyway, the first time we stopped at a little roadside restaurant to have lunch, they served us what you see in this photo. Well, the green pods there are cowpea pods. They're like green beans that we use, except a different species. The little sprouts are mung bean sprouts, which are also a green manure cover crop. And over on the left, you have tofu made out of soybeans. Turns out the farmers were using 2 and 3 and 4 different green manure crops in every field they had. You know, and here we were eating them. They weren't actually, you know, we weren't actually eating little round beans, but never the products of green manure cover crop species. Okay, the use of green manure cover crops is a major game changer in terms of climate change. Even just a moderately good green manure cover crop system, such as planting peanuts under pigeon peas. If you've never heard of pigeon peas, it's the fourth most widely eaten grain in the entire world after rice, maize, and wheat. It can sequester. This system can sequester long-term about 5.8 tons. That's what I said, about 6 tons per hectare per year of carbon in a decent soil. And I go on to say what I said earlier, that if all the farmers and ranchers in the world were to achieve anything similar to this, they could be sequestering, well, here it says over 85%. I say over 75% just to be cautious. That would be needed to reach the goals of the Paris Accords for the year 2100. In fact, I just received some reports from peer-reviewed literature describing what some researchers have found in southern Malawi using Gliricidia, which is one of the species I'll talk about in a minute, with maize for over 10 years, and they have produced about double this amount of long-term carbon. So, you know, I'm well within the ballpark here. How can we accomplish all this? The only solution is to build up soil organic matter in the farmers' fields and to do it with green manure cover crops. For smallholder farmers, there's not enough animal manure to do this. If they had enough animals to do that on even 1 hectare of land, they'd be rich people. They wouldn't be poor farmers anymore. Compost takes far too much work. To even just fix up 2.5 acres or 1 hectare, I've calculated that it would take, depending on how far you had to go to get the materials and stuff, it would take somewhere around 4 to 5 months of working totally just making compost every day for 4 or 5 months to produce that amount of organic matter. If we're, you know, compost is great for kitchen gardens. It's great for high value, to the extent that you can, fertilizing high value fruits and vegetables, but not for maize and sorghum and millet, cassava, and the other basic grains around the world. It doesn't pay. It's way too much work. Green manure cover crops, however, can produce over 40 tons per hectare per year of fresh organic matter each year. In over 50 years of working with smallholder farmers, I have never seen or heard of any smallholder farmer producing even 10 tons of compost in 1 year. So, I mean, the compost is just totally out of, it's totally insufficient to, fertilize and increase the fertility of a decent sized smallholder farmer's fields. It's impossible.
Roland, I just need to interrupt for 1 second.
Yeah.
You have about 10 minutes left, but
Okay.
then after that, you'll be in a workshop, and whoever wants to join you to go deeper into this conversation.
Okay, fine.
Is of
Fine.
course welcome
Yeah,
to
thank
do
you.
so.
Thank you for telling me that.
I have another question that has to do with this green manure. I'm wondering when you have like mining sites and things like that where there's no topsoil left, really, can these green manure legumes and things like that, are they able to take hold in when there's no topsoil and try and be pioneer species to create
Okay.
topsoil?
In cases where they've taken off the top layer, like they're taking material for building roads or they're mining or something like that, then these things are not going to be able to grow. What you'll probably have to do is either bring in a little bit of soil or bring in a little bit of soil and a little bit of animal manure, which would be even better. And then they will grow. Now, if the land is just degraded land that's become what we call wasteland, because it won't even grow pasture for animals, then yes, some of these green manures, not all of them, some of them. The best one is jack bean, but we can take jack bean into a field. It's I'll talk about that in a minute. And the jack bean will grow. I've seen it grow in everything except established grasslands. Now, if the grass has been growing there for 5 or 6 years, then the jack bean can't compete with the grass roots. It's just too big a mat of roots that competes with the jack bean, so it won't grow or won't grow well. But in a soil that say was farmed anytime in the last 2 or 3 years, or just is basically bare because it's becoming desert. Yes, the jack bean will be able to grow there. And even the pigeon pea and probably the gliricidia, if it doesn't have a real low pH. If the gliricidia is down below about 4.5, then it won't do well. But for instance, I've worked in what they call the Kalahari sands of Western Zambia, which are white sand that goes down 5 meters before you get any color at all in the soil. Okay, it's just pure white sand. And both the gliricidia didn't do very well because it had a low pH, I think. But the pigeon pea and the jack bean did quite well. So yes, we can start out with what most farmers think is impossible, is land that's impossible to grow anything on, and we can turn that into a good field within 3 years. Okay, I've done that with jack bean in quite a number of different places.
Roland?
Yeah.
What is a smallhold farm? How big is that, and what's a I don't think most of us know what a hectare is. We grow up with
Okay, I
square
should be
miles and
converting
acres.
everything into acres for you. The smallholder farmers in Africa have a different definition than in most of Latin America, but usually we consider smallholder farmers to be farmers that have less than about 4 or 5 hectares, which would be about 10 acres, 10 to 12 acres. Now in Brazil, they go a lot higher than that because they don't have any smallholder farmers by that definition, or very few. So they talk about smallholder farmers that have 20 or 30 acres. But in Africa and most of Latin America and Asia, a smallholder farmer is somebody that has less than about 10 or 15 acres. Okay.
Why don't
And
we
most
hold
of
off?
them, most
hold
of
off
them
on-
nowadays have less than 5 acres. I mean, in Africa, the average smallholder farmer holding right now is 1.5 hectares, which is would be about 3.5 to 4 acres.
So why don't we hold off with questions at the moment and let Roland finish his slideshow?
I'm pretty close to the end. Yeah.
Okay, and then
Okay.
we'll go to our workshop space.
Yeah. There are at least 115 green manure cover crop species present. Oh, how much do I have? About 5 more minutes?
5 minutes, yeah.
Okay. There are at least 115 green manure cover species presently being used around the world, not counting the trees. And I only count the systems, which I only count the species which farmers are using at least 5 years after any outside influence has left the area, and that is still being used by at least 100 farmers. So these are sustainably used species of green manure cover crops somewhere in the world. Probably the most useful for smallholder farmers generally around the world, the most widely useful, are jack beans, which I've already mentioned, Carnavalia, Lablab beans I also mentioned, and Gliricidia trees. Okay, I've mentioned all three of them actually. Okay, here's jack beans. This is growing in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where there was such a drought that the vast majority of the maize died. You can see there's probably only 1/10 of the maize plants still there because of the drought. And yet the jack beans look like they were irrigated yesterday. Okay, they're extremely drought resistant. They grow in very, very poor soils. These are very poor soils, and within 2 or 3 years, that maize will be looking totally different. Okay.
And the jack bean is edible?
No, this is not edible.
Okay.
It's interesting, but there is a evolutionary reason for this. The plants that are edible usually require better soils and more water. And that's because in a really droughty area, like the edge of a desert or in a pure desert, you have very few other plants. So the animals all come and eat. You know, if you've got an edible plant in there, the animals are going to finish it off because there isn't that much to eat out there. Okay. So the plants that do well in a desert or in a really dry area have developed either thorns or anti-nutritional factors or a terrible taste or something that will keep the animals from eating them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived.
How can they plant seeds through all that undergrowth?
That undergrowth is all jack bean. There's no weeds there. Well, there are a few
No, I
weeds
know,
right
but
up in the
how do you
foreground.
get seeds down into the earth?
Pardon?
How do you get seeds down into the earth through all that greenery?
Well, the greenery isn't there at the beginning of the wet season when you plant. See that
They're
greenery?
perennials?
That greenery you see in the bottom half of the photo is all jack bean. That's all green manure. It's completely eliminated the weeds.
But how do you put a seed? Does it die
Okay,
off?
in a lot of cases, for instance, in this case in Mexico, what they would do is they'd take a long stick, well, 2 meters long or two yards long, with a metal point at the end, and you just jab it into the ground, turn it around a couple of times, sort of move it around in a circle a couple of times, and you've opened a hole and a space for your crop to be planted.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's called a dibble stick.
That's very labor
it goes
intensive.
way, way, way back. I don't know, thousands and thousands of years.
Thank you.
Okay, now this is Lablab bean. This one won't grow in the really, really poor soils, but after we use jack bean a couple of years, people always want to know, well, our soil's really nice now. Can we use something we can eat? And the answer is definitely yes. There's several, in fact, quite a number, probably 15 or 20 or 30 different species that people can eat. This is my favorite. I'll tell you why for just very quickly. One is the beans are 50% more, have 50% more protein than our common beans do in the United States. So it's far more nutritious. I also like to use it in Africa because it's a native of Africa, native of East Africa, and people feel a lot of pride in the fact that their beans are better than the European beans. Because for centuries, they've been taught that everything from Europe was better than everything from Africa. And in this case, that's exactly the opposite of what's the truth. Furthermore, you can, when the leaves are young and tender, not at this stage, this is 3 months into the dry season. You can see that this is going to make it through the dry season. Okay. We're 3 months into the dry season. The maize was harvested some time ago, but the Lablab bean, as you can see way up at the top, is still producing seeds and has green leaves. And it will continue to grow until you kill it and plant your next maize crop when the rains come again, after 6 or 7 months of drought. But the beautiful thing is that I really love about this plant is the leaves are also edible. They can be eaten when they're young and tender, and they have about the same protein level as the beans on our common bean plants, and they're just the leaves. Furthermore, you can put them under a tree for 3 days, so if they dry out some, stick them in fertilizer sacks, and they will last for 12 months. Now, here we have dark green leaves. That's what they are when you harvest them, which means they have lots of vitamins and minerals. They have as much protein as our beans do, pound for pound, and they're available all year long. And furthermore, they're free because they're a free byproduct of growing the beans. So you have basically what I consider a nutritionist's dream, a high protein, high vitamin, high mineral food that's very easy to store, takes very little processing, has proteins, vitamins, and minerals in large quantities, and is available year round with very little
Roland,
mustard fuss.
does this grow in a temperate climate?
Not up here in the States. No, it won't take frost. But it's absolutely wonderful for virtually the whole developing world. It's now grown all over. In fact, there are areas where it's traditional in Peru, India, China, several countries of Southeast Asia, 2 or 3 countries of Africa, including Kenya and Malawi. It's already traditional. And what we're doing is just spreading it to the rest of the areas.
So it would grow in California and in Florida, here in this country?
Probably Southern California and Florida, yes. Mhm.
So
I've never tried it, but yeah, I'm sure it would. Now, here's one of the trees we use, Gliricidia. These Gliricidia trees, believe it or not, are only 4 years old. So they're very fast growing. They produce a tremendous amount of biomass, which is good for the soil. It's also good for the cattle. You can see we're toward the end of the dry season. There's nothing on the ground. The cattle have nothing to eat except tons and tons of Gliricidia leaves. The Gliricidia leaves are very high in protein and very good for cattle. In fact, they're university-educated dairy farmers in northern Honduras, large-scale dairy farmers that feed their cattle nothing but pasture grass, Gliricidia leaves, and salt licks. Okay, I mean, it provides all the protein animals could use and a lot of the vitamins and minerals. The flowers are edible, so people can also eat something off this tree. And furthermore, the trees, if they're properly pruned, now in this case, they weren't pruning them very much because they were making so much money off the seeds because these were so popular with other farmers. They were selling the seeds for $1 a kilo, which was big money for them. But anyway, if you pruned them more heavily, the crops under there would grow much better than they do without any shade at all, because in the lowland tropics, we already, with global warming, have an excess of heat. So by having these trees there, you actually increase your maize production. And as you can see, that the rows there, the maize rows, well, in this case, millet rows, go right next to the trees. They don't lose a single inch of growing space for their food crops. And the food crops will produce far more because of the fertilizer effect of the leaves and the protection from global warming.
So Roland, I think at this point, we should go to our.
This was my last photo and that was my last sentence.
Oh my God, what great timing. Okay, so John will, John, are you ready to put people in their breakout rooms?
I am.
You are.
Except we just have to, so we're gonna have three breakout rooms or
Two.
two breakout rooms?
Yeah.
Oh, right, Holly isn't doing it today. So we have Ellen and Hayat in one room and then Roland in another.
Okay.
If I could stay in this room I'm already in, that would be nice because I'm a bit IT challenged.
Okay.
So if I don't have to
Fair
switch
enough.
rooms, that would be a real help.
Okay.
Adam, where would you like me?
Well,
This is
hi Flo, aren't you going with Roland?
I think so, yes.
Well, Roland's going to stay right where you are.
Okay,
So you and he will be together, and then
okay.
Ellen and Hayat will be in a breakout room, which you really don't have to do anything. John has to do all the heavy lifting, and you can see he's been.
So the
doing his
one
weights
thing that we need is if we want to record the Ellen and Hyatt's breakout room, we just need one person who can record in there.
Oh,
Yeah, I can do it again.
Oh, thank you, Charlie.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't rename it.
Okay. All right, so just let me get this started here. I need to.
Nice to see you, Flo.
Nice to see you too.
Well, while we're waiting, do the two of you want to say a little bit about how you know each other?
Well, I knew of Roland long before I had the pleasure of knowing him in person. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer back in the early 90s, our Bible was 2 Ears of Corn. So many years later, at a Regeneration International summit down in Mexico, I was very pleased to connect with Roland, and I'm very grateful that he's been acting as an advisor for some of my organization's work since then.
Want to tell them your organization's name, Flo?
Sure. My organization is Sustainable Harvest International, and we've been running a regenerative agroecology extension program in Central America for the last 23 years. And now are working towards a scaling up goal to help 1 million farms transition to regenerative agroecology by 2030, including plenty of cover crops and green manures, of course.
Okay,
I
so
hadn't heard about your scaling up. That's great.
I don't mean to interrupt, but so people want to just type into the chat if you want to, just type Ellen if you want to go into Ellen and Hyatt's room, and I'll start adding people. Just take a minute.
So you've got a moment to go get a quick bite of lunch if you didn't get one before. It's a little bit strange to see people disappearing.
Strange. I think it's strange there's somebody left.
Yeah, it's strange that we're all here in the same place from so many different parts of the world.
Ah. Seal Smith is actually having breakfast now in Alaska.
Adam, will you be sending out a list of all of emails?
I think I need to ask for people's permission first.
Mhm.
So I will send out an email asking for permission. And I suspect that just about everybody will say, okay, but there may be people who prefer to maintain their privacy, which of course
Great.
we respect. But yes, and then we'll send it out to the group.
And how long are we going to be in the workshop?
Officially, it's an hour, but for all practical purposes, it's as long as you like.
Okay.
So.
And we're
it's-
starting like in 5 minutes or 3
As
minutes?
soon.
Yeah, so I think that's everyone. If you didn't get an invitation to move to the other room and you're
Well,
still
Ellen
here, you
has to
wanna
move.
go?
John,
Oh,
Ellen.
Okay.
Yes.
I haven't moved and neither is Hyatt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
You're going to be moved
Okay, great.
because you didn't type it into the chat that you wanted to be in the same room with you.
Okay. So, okay.
What does the invitation look like?
It'll pop up on your screen and say that, you know, oh, actually, I have to click that. Sorry.
So we're still, getting used to the technology, but it's not going too bad.
And it takes a lot less time than actually moving everybody into another room.
Yeah, if we were
on foot.
at Tufts, it would be.
Right.
So yeah, you should have all got invitations to go into the other room who asked for them. So if I missed anyone.
Hyatt, you missed Hyatt, John.
Did I?
Yes, you did. Because she's still here. Oh, there she goes.
I don't know. I think you have to give me permission again to record.
Okay.
Or
Yep.
John, yeah.
Thank you. Yep. To record, right, okay. I'm doing that.